The First World War was unlike anything that came before. It unleashed mechanized industrial warfare across the globe, destroying 4 great empires and killing over 16 million people. But why did it turn out the way it did? Why did the Allies win the First World War? Well, using IWM London's First World War galleries, we'll journey through the key events, turning points, and human stories that decided the outcome. This is why the Allies won the First World War. First, let's go back to 1914. These were the world's great powers. Some were established powers like Russia, France, and Britain. Some were in decline, like Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. And then there were the upstarts, Germany and Italy in Europe, and US and Japan further out. All these powers were locked in intense competition with each other. Britain wanted to maintain its global empire and found itself at odds with Russia and the Ottomans over the Middle East. Likewise, Russia and Austria-Hungary were competing over the Balkans, and France and Italy were competing over North Africa. Italy wanted parts of Austria, France wanted part of Germany, and Germany wanted a global empire all of its own. These conflicting goals pushed Europe into 2 opposing blocks of power. Germany formed an alliance with its neighbour Austria-Hungary and then Italy, becoming known as the Central Powers. This led to an unlikely alliance between Russia and France, who both feared Germany's growing strength. There was also fear in Britain when Germany initiated a naval arms race between the two. They soon joined France and Russia to form the Triple Entente. With the power blocks in place and sky-high tensions between them, all that was needed was a spark. It came in the Balkans when the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne was assassinated by a Serb-backed terrorist. Austria-Hungary wanted to crush Serbia, but their ally Germany knew that Russia would likely side with the Serbs, triggering a wider war. Their decision would prove pivotal.
There was a widespread expectation that at some point there would be a major conflict between the great powers, decided in a single battle. Beyond the local consequences of the assassination, as perceived by the Austro-Hungarians, the Germans were chiefly concerned with the 2 imperial powers on their eastern and western borders, of which their greatest threat was reckoned to be Russia. Catalysed by humiliating defeat at the hands of the Japanese in 1905, Russia had sought to modernise and industrialise. It was feared that by 1917, Russia might be almost unbeatable, able to raise millions of men uniformed and equipped like this. However, in 1914, Germany had the world's strongest military. They believed that this was their only chance to achieve a decisive victory over Russia. If there was going to be a war, now was the best time to fight it.
On the 28th of July, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, and Europe marched to war. Only Italy and Britain stayed out, the terms of their alliances not yet compelling them to intervene. Now, looking at a map, the Central Powers appeared to be in a perilous position, surrounded from east and west. But Germany had a plan. Believing that the Russians would take longer to mobilise than other European armies, they decided to focus almost all their resources on defeating France first. They launched a risky flanking manoeuvre through Belgium and Luxembourg, aiming to encircle Paris. This began well, but it had 2 negative consequences. First, their advance was marked by widespread atrocities against the Belgian and French people, which turned public opinion against them. Second, it brought Britain into the war on the Allied side, as they were treaty-bound to defend Belgian neutrality. Still, the Germans continued their advance into France, pushing the Allies back to the River Marne. The stage was set for the most decisive battle of the war.
The German armies were increasingly exhausted as they approached Paris. Logistics were strained to breaking point to keep up. Germany had intended to wheel around west of Paris, but the prospect of reinforcing success and gaining a share of the glory by turning inside proved too tempting for one German army commander. This opened the possibility of a counterattack into the German flank with troops from the Paris garrison. The Germans in turn had to stand and face this counterattack, opening a gap in their armies which the Allied High Command exploited. It was a defeat that changed the character of the war. On the Western Front, both sides began to dig in for protection. Entrenching tools like this became vital equipment. Germany's chance for a short war was gone.
The losses in those first few months of war were cataclysmic. Casualties on all fronts for the year 1914 topped 5 million, as all sides were forced to come to terms with the devastating effectiveness of modern weaponry. The Western Front would remain a stalemate for another 2 years. On the Eastern Front though, it was a different story. Here there was room to manoeuvre, and first at Tannenberg and then the Masurian Lakes, Germany inflicted crushing defeats on Russia. However, their ally Austria-Hungary was routed in Galicia, and their invasion of Serbia ended in disaster.
Despite their actions in provoking the war, Austria-Hungary was totally unprepared for what became a conflict on 3 fronts. The Empire had invested considerably less than the other powers in the military before the war. Their mobilisation was confused and chaotic, their tactics were totally outdated, and their cavalry reconnaissance, the responsibility of regiments like the one represented by this uniform, was wholly inadequate. As a consequence, the Austro-Hungarians did not advance far into Serbia. A skillful defence, given impetus by widespread atrocities committed by the invaders, soon countered the invasion, sending the Austro-Hungarians into full retreat. As the war progressed, they would become more and more dependent on Germany, who felt increasingly frustrated they had been shackled to a corpse.
By the end of 1914, the Ottoman Empire and Japan had both joined the war, helping to cement it as a truly global conflict. Germany's colonial possessions in the Pacific were snapped up by Britain and Japan, while their possessions in Africa were subject to British and French offensives. Similarly, Ottoman possessions came under attack from Britain and France in the Middle East and Russia in the Caucasus, which formed the backdrop for the Armenian genocide, in which up to 1.5 million people lost their lives. These campaigns lasted the length of the war and were largely fought by colonial troops, an asset the Central Powers had far less of. However, the fighting had less to do with the outcome of the conflict and more to do with Europe's desire for empire building. Instead, victory in this war would be decided by economics.
All sides had expected the war to be decided in a single decisive battle. But now they had to settle themselves in for a long war of attrition. The Allies were far better equipped to win that battle, with larger economies, bigger populations and higher levels of development. Both Britain and France set about creating a home front to supply the fighting fronts with the men, weapons, equipment and food they needed. They built a network of factories for weapons production and recruited an army of men and women to work in them. They also passed laws which controlled people's lives in ways they had never expected and imposed higher levels of taxation than ever before. There were some problems. France had lost important regions of resource and industry and had to resort to extensive borrowing to rebuild its industrial power. While Britain did manage to bankroll the Allies until 1916, she eventually ran out of funds. As a result, the Allies had to turn to the United States for money, leaving them in massive debt.
One thing Germany did have over its enemies was the world's largest chemical industry, and in 1915 they used poison gas in a significant attack for the first time. However, this failed to achieve the breakthrough that was expected and provoked further outrage in neutral countries. After that, they took an increasingly defensive posture in the West, defeating several major French offensives and helping their Ottoman allies win an important defensive victory at Gallipoli. In May, Italy entered the war on the Allies' side, attacking Austria-Hungary. They would launch a total of 11 offensives at the Isonzo River over the next 2 years, but gained only tiny slivers of territory at the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives. In Russia, the Germans were able to score a series of stunning victories after forcing their allies to work under unified command, while in the Balkans, Bulgaria joined the Central Powers and helped to crush Serbia and Montenegro. Still, the Central Powers were in a difficult position. Not only were they fighting on multiple fronts against a superior enemy, but on top of that, their home front was becoming increasingly stretched.
Britain's Royal Navy had blockaded German ports from the outset of the war, stopping supplies from getting in or out. This was combined with a series of poor harvests, mismanagement, and Russia's occupation of Galicia, Austria's biggest producer of grain. As a result, the Central Powers experienced increasingly difficult food shortages, with catastrophic effects on civilian morale. Early in 1915, ersatz products like these began to be used as substitutes in bread, and rationing was introduced. However, shortages often made the notional ration of milk, sugar, meat, and other goods fanciful, rather than grounded in reality. Without the war providing an opportunity for the Germans to meet the Royal Navy in fleet battle, Germany instead decided to apply a blockade of its own, using its U-boats. This was successful in disrupting Allied supply chains. But after the Cunard liner Lusitania was sunk by a German torpedo in May 1915, Germany was forced to suspend its campaign for fear of bringing the United States into the war on the Allied side.
Under this pressure, the Central Powers knew they needed to knock out an Allied power as quickly as possible, and in 1916 they set out to do just that, once again setting their sights on France. They attacked the fortress city of Verdun, hoping that the French would suffer such terrible casualties trying to take it back that they would make peace. The result was the longest battle of the war, a brutal meat grinder that came to symbolise the French struggle for national survival. To take pressure off, Britain was forced to take the lead in the upcoming Allied offensive on the Somme. However, the British army was inexperienced and unprepared, and the initial attack became the costliest day in British military history. Still, the attack continued in order to help the French, and as it did, the Allies began to learn valuable lessons about how to fight a modern war.
With the British on the Somme taking for the first time the main burden of attacking, they naturally suffered casualties in the same proportions as their allies the French had earlier in the war. However, the appalling first day of the Somme was also just that, the first day. As the offensive continued, the British learned and innovated, sometimes successfully, often not. New weapons like the tank, first deployed in September 1916, and new fighting techniques like creeping barrages were introduced. Likewise, the air dimension was increasingly integrated into the Army's fighting methods. It was the beginning of a shift away from manpower to machine power. Though the fighting remained costly and difficult, these innovations would bear fruit in the future.
In the east, Russia launched a new offensive, with their innovative tactics causing heavy Austro-Hungarian casualties. Their success encouraged Romania to join the Allied side, but they were largely overrun. Exhaustion was beginning to take hold on the Eastern Front. Meanwhile, at sea, the only major fleet battle of the war took place, the Battle of Jutland, where British and German dreadnought battleships finally clashed. The result was a stalemate and the continuation of Britain's suffocating blockade. This, combined with the unexpectedly heavy losses they had suffered in 1916, forced Germany to change its strategy.
In late 1916, new leaders emerged in Germany. Erich Ludendorff and Paul von Hindenburg, seen here in German propaganda posters. They withdrew Germany's forces on the Western Front to the Hindenburg Line to shorten the length of the front. They also adopted what became known as the Hindenburg Programme. This set Germany's war economy to emphasise production for the consumption of the armed forces and for the pursuit of their war aims. It neglected the fact that the troops' morale was massively impacted by news of the people they were fighting for starving at home. Imperial Germany became a machine for waging war and little else. But perhaps their most pivotal decision was to resume unrestricted submarine warfare, attempting to starve Britain into submission. This risked bringing the United States into the war on the Allied side, but it was a gamble they felt compelled to take. The U-boats did push Britain to the brink of a shipping crisis, but Britain introduced a convoy system which blunted the threat. Finally, Germany's mistake in sending the Zimmermann telegram asking Mexico to invade the US was exposed by Allied codebreakers, and as a result, America's vast industrial and military potential was added to the Allied cause.
As the Allies strengthened, the Central Powers grew weaker. Austria-Hungary was beginning to buckle from food shortages, ethnic tensions, and the death of its ruling emperor. Meanwhile, the Ottomans were in full retreat, having lost Baghdad and Jerusalem to the British and their Arab allies. However, on the Western Front, stalemate continued. The French army teetered on the brink of mutiny after the disastrous Nivelle offensive, while at Passchendaele, another attritional horror show ensued. With American troops set to arrive in force the following year, the Allies felt sure that they would win the war eventually. But shocking news from Russia threw the Central Powers a lifeline.
In 1917, Tsarist Russia collapsed. Many issues already present in pre-war Russian society, especially the unpopularity of the Tsar and the incompetence, corruption and repressive nature of successive governments, ultimately provoked unrest and revolution. The demands of total war had led to economic and social upheavals which might have been handled with intelligence, but the Tsar stubbornly refused to consider changes that might have helped bring stability to the army, the nation and his regime. In March 1917, he was forced to abdicate and a provisional government was formed. However, the problems of food shortages and runaway inflation remained. The Bolshevik Party, who promised to pull Russia from the war, gained huge support, with workers carrying banners like this one. In November 1917, they launched a successful coup that overthrew the provisional government and they began peace negotiations. In the subsequent treaty, the Central Powers seized huge amounts of territory, which helped to alleviate some of their own food shortages. Victory had been achieved on the Eastern Front. Now, it was time to make a reckoning in the West.
The defeat of Russia freed up huge reserves of fighting men for the Central Powers, giving them one final chance to defeat the Allies before American troops tipped the balance. In the spring of 1918, Germany launched its all-out offensive, the Kaiserschlacht. Initially, the attacks were extremely successful, with new stormtrooper tactics resulting in unprecedented gains. But there was a lack of strategic direction, and the German forces quickly outran their supplies and artillery. When they captured Allied supply dumps, morale actually fell as the Germans realised just how richly supplied the Allies were in comparison to them. As the attacks continued, casualties began to mount, with the losses concentrated amongst the best units. The Allies were able to absorb the blow.
The Allies finally agreed to a single commander being in overall charge of military operations on all fronts. He then led a powerful counterattack. Increasingly, the Allies deployed machines to conduct the war and manage their declining manpower resources. More tanks, bigger guns, more automatic weapons and machine guns. They also improved their tactics, deploying light machine guns and rifle grenades like these with the attacking troops. The Allies now made best use of mechanised means like trains, buses and lots of lorries to move forces laterally to new sectors. An offensive at one point in the line was swiftly followed up with an attack in a different sector and then another in a third. What began with the Second Battle of the Marne in mid-July was followed up at Amiens in August. The advance continued to maintain momentum, although resistance was fierce. It was no walkover, but the Central Powers' military might was broken. the Allies were going to win the war.
The Central Powers were now in full retreat on all fronts. Bulgaria dropped out of the war in September, the Ottomans in October, and the Austro-Hungarians in November. Uprisings now began to spread across Germany, forcing the Kaiser to abdicate, and on the 11th of November 1918, an armistice was agreed. The First World War was over, with the Allies victorious. In truth, they were always likely to win. Once Germany's short war gamble failed, the economic factors of total war became inescapable. The Allies were better able to mobilise their resources, secure the morale of their populations, and adapt to the demands of modern mechanised war. In the end, it was a winning combination.
In all the analysis of political, military and economic decisions in the Great War, we should not lose sight of the myriad millions of individual stories that the war comprised. The war was won at tremendous personal cost to the people of all combatant nations in terms of their family members and friends, but also in terms of the demands made of the civilian population. Not just with taxation, rationing, etc., but with the utter misery of uncertainty that war delivered. It was people who suffered hardship and loss, and people who secured victory.